Good evening and welcome to this week's episode of Hot Topics, where we're going to be continuing our conversation on the Christian and COVID-19. In this week's conversation, we're going to be reflecting on a conversation between Bishop Joshua Mabonga and Reverend Molo from the South African Council of Churches, where they picked up on a conversation around what does it mean to reimagine how we do church in light of everything that's been happening around us, and that is our use of technology, but also how we've managed to explore and expand our knowledge of how church can be done through the different platforms that we are offered by the technological changes in society.
So I think an important thing to note with this conversation is we've started to realize that this is a long-term thing. You know, it's a pandemic that's been international. I think if we take it back to the first cases that were found globally, we're nearly sitting on 2-3 years now by the time that this is over. And as the church, we can no longer exist from a place of this is a quick over and then we go back to the normality, but we have to start to realize that this is really not just the term that we're throwing around, the new normal, but that our normal both now and long term will have to be derived from what we have now. There is no going back to a place of where we were before. And so it's time that we start working and genuinely putting in the effort to start reimagining what church could look like and with technology.
And for me, Els, before we go to the clip with Reverend Molo, it's actually amazing how much we usually, we never want to move with the times up until a tragedy hits, or up until there's something that really forces us to begin to adapt how we do things to what is happening around us. One of the most interesting things, is the fact that churches are usually resistant to change. That's one thing I've seen. You look in history, churches did not want to acknowledge that they had a responsibility to minister to youth. And it is only after the first industrial revolution, when they realized that families have been split and there's a youth culture that is emerging that the church needs to respond to, that the church again is caught on its back foot, and then it wants to respond. And again, even with what is happening right now, technology has long been advancing. There's long been a need for churches to find ways of ministering or engaging people through the various platforms that we are offered by how technology has advanced in society. And it is so weird, or rather, it is rather odd, that churches again are caught on a back foot and they're forced to react as opposed to being proactive. Will it always take a crisis to force churches to adapt to what is happening around them? Are we that arrogant? Are we that overconfident in how we do things? Will it always require a tragedy, a crisis, for us to begin to adapt? In actual fact, you've got churches that to this day refuse to put up projectors because they're adamant that our hymn books are the best way of doing things. You've got churches that still refuse to explore other ways of doing communion because they're adamant that our traditions and the physical contact is the only way we can do things. You've got churches that refused to reimagine ways of doing the Ash Wednesday service because they're adamant that this is tradition, this is what we'll stick to, and nothing will move or change how we do things. Will it take another tragedy to get churches to realize that now is the time to adapt?
And I think the important thing within all of that is that constantly when we refuse to change, we isolate and exclude people even more. If we look at the traditional way of doing communion, there's people that are not physically able to come to church to receive communion in that way. People that are not able to, if they are in a wheelchair, for example, to come up to the rail, as in some churches. There has been no rail that's been adapted for them to also come and receive. And that resistance to tradition and to change our way doesn't help us. We've got, with youth and spaces for the youth, we've got resistance to change, and that excludes youth, and ultimately will contribute to the death of the church as we know it if we're not able to change our rigid structures to meet where people are at currently. Even with our evening church model in some churches before, we refused to adapt how we did church. We either had an evening service or didn't have. We didn't think of people that are not able to attend any of those services. How do those people that are not able to make the morning service, the evening service, the 12 o'clock service, how do they receive the gospel, their teaching, the word? And so even with technology and its changes, yes, things are not the same, but it's given us an opportunity to actually include people that formerly couldn't be included. People that work on Sundays, people in retail and hospitality that actually work on Sundays. They can now access church online and watch it when they're off on a Monday or a Tuesday or even middle of the week when no church is able to provide services. And so as we resist change, we sometimes exclude, but without necessarily being intentional about exclusion. But now as the church, we're given an opportunity to take this forced change and let it be a vessel for inclusion and a new way of doing church and doing things. So I think, yes, it's both. It's good and it's bad. It's got its ways, but we cannot be dragging our feet because we're missing wonderful opportunities.
Absolutely. And I'm so grateful that tragedies always give us clarity around what a priority is. You know, and perhaps this is one thing we should take out of this, that tragedies always have a way of giving us clarity, giving us perspective. But let us hear more from Reverend Mzwandile Molo and Bishop Mabonga as they continue to engage. What does it mean to reimagine church in light of what is happening around us?
Thank you so much, Bishop. And I want to pick up from that point when we speak about the whole idea of the evolution of culture, that culture is evolving and even how we do church is evolving. And right now the pandemic has forced us to even reimagine how we actually do church. Now, picking it up from there, we already know that Europe, many years ago, had already started flirting with the idea of a postmodern world with no religion. If you've heard John Lennon, imagine a world with no religion where the people are one. I want to pick it up from there and reconcile that with the comments that you made, Mkhulu. And I then want to speak about the idea of actually saying, could this pandemic and sometimes how we're responding to this pandemic, for instance, for those who are extremists that are saying, let us completely stop.
Because we're losing the chairman in a few moments.
Yes.
I want us to maybe direct the question and say, how is the church responding to the evolving of the church? Is the church prepared? Has the church put protocols in place? Because now we're in emergency protocols. But going forward, from his own words, Corona is going to be here for a longer time. Are there proper procedures, training, development of the modern pastor to begin to deal and prepare himself for the church in the next 10, 15, 20 years, which is actually going to become a virtual church? I just thought
absolutely. So I think, Babu Molo, if you can pick up on that particular question and then also help us engage also with the idea of then saying, could the easing on religious gatherings encourage young people to begin to imagine a world with no corporate gathering, a world where spirituality is a private matter and not a corporate matter?
Thank you very much. The questions that you are raising, sorry, are questions that should occupy any serious-minded person in the world right now, because indeed, life as we know it, is gone. The social constructs that gives us a certain kind of meaning have been not only stretched by COVID-19, they have been strained to a point where they are unable to make true sense of how to respond to this. The notion of family, even in the context of funerals, is strained. How do you become a wife? How do you become a wife when you can't attend your husband's funeral because you are infected yourself, and therefore you must either depend on noise or your husband? It really stretches everything that we know of as life as we know it. Therefore, church itself, I would personally even go further. Faith itself will need to find a way to reimagine itself. What does it mean to believe in God? Before I came to this service, before I came to this conversation right now, I was listening in a virtual way, part of a covenant service in the Methodist Church of Southern Africa. And there are big questions we need to imagine for ourselves. What does it mean to believe in God? And somebody was preaching today and say God is in control. I am struggling in my mind to say, what does that mean? What What does that mean to say God is in control and people are dying like they do? I'm almost tempted to go back to that Moses question before the church, before God. And when Moses is told to go back to the people in Egypt, people who have been in slavery for generations, and God says, go and tell them that I want to release them. And Moses' question simply is, who are you? Who are you? If I go to these people to tell them that you want them liberated, who are you? And therefore, we need to be asking these questions for ourselves in a deep, imaginative way to say, who is God? How do we relate with God? How do we understand God? And for me, this in the tragedy of the moment, this is a moment of fertile imagination for us to imagine in a fertile way. How do we talk about faith? How do we talk about love? How do we talk about family? And therefore, because we're in the genesis of this response, we as the SACC are challenging our member churches to say, we cannot go back to a life before COVID. We need to redefine what church is. The Methodist Church has got the presiding bishop who called on the Methodists to say, reimagine life, health and transformation. We need to talk about that. The way we trained priests and pastors, we must engage what does that mean. So we are in a space of fertile reimagination that we're asking all our member churches to do. Young people must be in the forefront of the search for new ways of how to be community. Then we must be in the forefront of asking the question, what does it mean to be in community when proximity is a challenge? What does it mean for me to talk to you right now? And can I give meaning to that? That transcends the quest for feeling your touch, which is basically how we human feelings we perceive as being communicated. And that all of us have got that responsibility to do so. And the church itself, if it's serious about life, it has to generate for its own reflection a way that says, how do we inculcate life-enhancing ways that transcends physical life, but makes life, as Christ calls it, life in abundance? That's the challenge we all face. And the SACC is doing its own part. We engage the scientists to talk about what it means. We engage the technology people to talk about that. We are also calling on our theologians to stop going back to the platitudes of the past, but to find new language. If I can say something, Luciano, before I go, and this is a personal point of mine, the language of the past is insufficient to give expression to what we are going through right now. The metaphors of the past are not comprehensive enough to allow us to engage with the tragic moment of our reality currently. And it is our responsibility as this generation to develop new metaphors and new ways of being that speak to the depth of the crisis we go through, yet find the hope and the healing that transcends metaphors of the past.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Babamola. I do not know if there's any other question before we allow you to go.
Just one. I know this is. I promised myself to be quiet. It's one thing to talk as administrators and planners. It's another thing to take this conversation into practical methodologies, where under the SACC, all the colleges, all the universities that are producing pastors, are we looking at a curriculum change of an e-based ministry, of a virtual kind of interaction? Are we looking at new methodologies of theologizing and beginning to build doctrinal understanding which responds to the pandemic at hand? Or we are responding to the pandemic in one little house on the other side, but the protocols in terms of our academic preparation of ministers still remains colonial and ancient, even as ancient as 14th, 15th, 16th century theology, which is still being taught to the student. Yet the student with an ancient theology must be responding to the 21st century challenges. Here we are arguing about dressing, about music, about trinities and all these things. And Corona looks us in the eye and there's no respect for the theological dogma that is there. So my question could be, through you, Honorable Chair, Is it possible that the pandemic is actually giving, I like the word that he used when he said we're in a moment of creative reimagination. Is this creative reimagination reactive, or it is actually fundamental, theologically transforming, to say what form of theological transformation and dogmatic development do we need to develop a theology which responds to the 21st century pandemic? We still believe in baptism by immersion. You must be in the hands of a pastor, and the pastor must put you in the water, and then you are baptized. Now the patient has got corona, and they are on their deathbed, and they want to be baptized. Are we now beginning to rethink how do we baptize a member who is on a deathbed? They have 2 days to go. You as a pastor cannot touch them. They can't touch you because there's a pandemic. How do we respond theologically to some of these issues? To me, these are pertinent issues. People want to eat their sacraments. Mfundis must break the bread and put it in my mouth and eat. Now I can't see you, I can't see me. Can we begin to move these services so that families can begin to conduct communion services by themselves? The list goes on and on and on. The question is, theologically speaking, how do we begin to frame, think, plan theological positions which positively respond to the pandemic? Whereas ecumenical power has been locked up in the echelons of theological dogma and ecclesiastical leaders. Now that the leaders are being pushed out due to the pandemic, is it possible that theologically speaking, we can begin to relinquish some of these powers to the husbands, to the fathers and the mothers in their homes, so that the church concept is moved from a building at the corner of Claim Street to an address in 72 Sunnyside, where a husband and his wife and children can begin to practice ecumenical and liturgical, rituals within the confines of their own homes.
Let us not even waste any time on that.
Thank you. Thank you very much. To respond to the bishop, let me just kind of clarify the SACC, how it functions. Indeed, we do not call for dogmatic essentialism in the way we operate with our churches. We actually do not enter into doctrinal debates with our members because we represent a diverse group of people. But what I'm prepared to say to the bishop is that the pandemic itself is for me an intensifier. And indeed, what's the right word I'm looking for? It forces us to get our minds together. In the tradition of the SACC, if you go back in its own engagements, from the moment where we were talking and dealing with the crimes of apartheid, the commitment has always been to shift theological thinking away from dogmatic purity into praxis of liberation and of love. And because that has been our focus, we have been in constant contestation with what has been, if I'm frank, and that's where the bishop is correct, with the hegemonic power of the Western way of theologizing that has found its way not only to impose its will, but the way to adjust and even absorb the protests against its power and streamline it into its own ways of doing things. So we have been part of that great challenge, and as the bishop, as a student of history, will know that when you are dealing with a hegemonic presence, you are going to deal with it in constant struggles where the power itself wants to reimpose itself. So the SACC has always been committed to the liberation of what some of us call liberating the text from the hands of those in power into the hands of those who are vulnerable in society, such that those who are vulnerable in society are able to find liberative ways. And those of us who know some history will know that the greatest example of that is what was called the base community in Latin America, where because of the oppression, for example, of the Batista regimes in places like El Salvador and other places like in Brazil, where people will meet and find the liberative power of the text in the small communities that they gather for them to find the liberative power to journey with them. So the SACC has been part of that tradition that seeks to say that institutions are not meant to be prisons. They are meant to be facilitators of a deeper discovery of what it is to be a Christian in the world. So the SACC has been part of that. What the pandemic has done, even in the economic sphere, even in the social sphere, the pandemic says to all of us, your yesterday is not sufficient to deal with today. You either wish to go back to your yesterday and find ways to preserve your yesterday. And please remember, if you remain in yesterday, you'll be like one who's in a deep freezer who has no ability to change today because you are frozen in the past. Because what we need now is to find ways of being energized in a way that says, how do we make sure that an old person, I have been a pastor, fortunately I'm not a pastor right now of a local church, but how do you communicate love? Because ultimately, what is a sacrament? What is a sacrament? When we share bread, when we share wine, what are we doing there? We are not, let's go back to the joke that the bishop done. We are not just kind of trying to make you get blood and flesh. We are seeking to communicate to you in a metaphor. And that metaphor says, those in the Methodist Church believe that a sacrament is a means of grace, is a communicator of God's love and God's presence in the midst of our lives. So how do we then develop ways that communicate to people the mysteries of God's presence, even in the current context? A church, a denomination, an institution, a faith community that does not think to itself, how do we do with the technology as we have it? How do we fight with those who own data companies to take down the data? Because we don't want to create a situation whereby the church becomes a place for the elite, where the elite, because they've got access to data, are able to get to that. How do we speak to our public broadcaster and say to our public broadcaster, our people's faith is an essential part of who they are? How do we communicate to our people the sense of being community together? If a church doesn't think and apply the mind to the issues that the bishop is raising, that church is bound to die. That church will be irrelevant in the next 50 years of the life. A church that depends on certitudes, a church that belongs and saying, I can stamp in my pulpit and shout at my pulpit that God is good all the time. That church is doing a disservice to God's people, because the God I believe in, the God that the SACC believes in, is a God who left heaven. Who left heaven. If you follow the Pauline tradition, if you follow Luke, he became Emmanuel. He decided to say, the lofty places of heaven are not the places where I need to be found. And this is the beauty of at least my understanding of the Christian faith. The Jesus who is born in the world is not born in any temple, is not born in any fleshy palace. Palaces and fleshy places are deliberately avoided by God. He is born with his family in a stable. With his family in a stable. That for me is the most powerful metaphor we can remind ourselves in. God's presence is not located in physicality in terms of buildings. How then do we then answer the questions that the bishop is raising? And I'm sure all of us have the responsibility to think. We are only a year into this pandemic. I always tell people, be very careful of building up answers that you believe answer everything, because you are going to be a fundamentalist who is dangerous to yourself. You need to be open to the reality that we are going through a pandemic where we need to find new information. If you indulge me, I was very disappointed with the discovery, the SACC is disappointed with the fact that when we said to our people, don't take the casket to home, please wrap people with plastics. We are very angry to discover right now that actually those people who were giving that scientific information, or those who recommended this, are kind of distancing themselves from that recommendation, because we know that our people have going to go back to Anele. We are dealing with the reality that our people haven't found closure, because we're told, don't bring the casket home. Let it, if it's going to be there, let it pass there. Don't take it off the thing. And our people have cried tears because they've not been able to look at their people and find closure. We are very disappointed with that. And we are hoping that somebody who made that recommendation will come up and say, sorry, I made a mistake. The truth is, we were doing some precautions and we went overboard. And I think we will deal with that. But to sit here and say to our people, don't worry, the 43,000 people, if you multiply that by 5 family members, multiply that by 5. I'm not even talking about those who are relatives. I'm not even talking about those who are friends. Millions of our people are living with a deep wound because they were not able to say farewell to their friends the way we do. And we're saying to those who are scientific, please do not be blinded by science. Science is a gift, but science is not an answer to everything. There is some things that science cannot answer. And because we believe in faith, we are people are able to transcend then science and say science is the tool. But there are other ways to derive meaning. And that is where we are.
Dr. Molo, just before we go, about 2 minutes or 3 minutes left before I let you go through the honorable chair. The last comment that I would have, let me not even make it a question. Let me make it a comment. Then you can just respond to the comment directly. SACC, South African Council of Churches, is as an armpit, as an influence across a number of denominations. And we believe so that your greater part of your membership is actually an educated, progressive membership. Inclusive to that are politicians. Inclusive to that are scientists. Inclusive to that are educationists. The fraternities are countless. And as a South African Council of Churches, my comment, I was going to make it a question, but because of time, I'll make it into a comment. Is it possible, or will you make it possible, within your organization, I recommend that you gather together all the doctors, all the pharmacists, and all the professionals who are within your congregational influence, so that the solutions that we are looking for, instead of us always focusing on ministers who are more on the doctrinal side, those conferences have been organized from the Council of Nicene to date. We need now to change the South African Council of Churches into a medical consultative forum, into a pharmaceutical consultative forum, into a psychological consultative forum, so that the professionals who are within our religious space of influence can come together, can begin to discuss, and the protocols that the government is giving us, we as a church can actually begin to draft, design protocols that say, we as a people, we have 500,000 doctors here, and if they say that we can meet, and these are the requirements for meeting, then it's doable, so that we convert the organization from just being that of ecclesiastical, liturgical preservation into a psychosocial, religio, political, economic, conversation, so that we can engage the government as a body that represents the people.
Thank you. I can respond to that, Bishop. Firstly, Bishop, I'll just have a slight differentiation with you. The SACC is not for the preservation of liturgical and doctrinal traditions. We are, just call ourselves, we are trans-doctrinal. As I said to you, we've got Zionists there, we've got Methodists there, we've got Anglicans, we've got Catholics. So we are not there to preserve liturgies and doctrines, just that sense. Bishop, if you read the SACC, even before COVID, we 5 years ago, we developed what we call the South Africa We Pray For. And in that South Africa We Pray For, there are things we identify as key areas of life. One of them is education, for example. And in that, we are making a call to our member churches to help us then facilitate a gathering of educationists who are going to help us reflect even before the pandemic itself. The pandemic is going to make the thing worse. The reality is the education system in South Africa is not serving a poor child. It's actually designed in many ways to sideline that poor child. And if a poor child gets an A or 5 A's or 6 A's, we are in that little problematic space where the exception is elevated as a reflection of the norm. And therefore, they take one child who is exceptional in some village, and they elevate that child to tell everybody else that if this child can do this, everybody should be doing that. And we are saying, no, the system itself is not geared towards helping young people to get to be educated. So we have reflected on that, and therefore, by the time we come to the pandemic, we've got a document that we call a pastoral response to the pandemic. And out of that document, Bishop, we are saying those who are scientific in our churches, for that matter, Bishop, we have suggested that every local community, every local church should consult its own members who are scientifically trained to make sure that they understand this thing at the local level. Because we do recognize, Bishop, that when we meet at the highest level, but we depend on people to take decisions in a meeting and send it somewhere. Our viewers, make your scientists at the local level to be your biggest point of reference and speak about that so that we can generate from that an understanding. So a short answer is that strategy is part of what we seek to do. As I indicated, Bishop, earlier, the protocols that the SACC have developed were also protocols where we consulted scientists and said to scientists, we hear what Karim is telling us. Give us your honest, independent analysis of that. So we've engaged with them. So the point you're making is one that we take on board gladly because it is part of what we seek to pursue as we move into the future.
All right, I'll hand over to you so that we can take a small little short break. But from my desk, Honorable Reverend, I truly appreciate your presence today, and I'm very grateful. From the expressions that I'm hearing, I don't think we have lines of differences except what is exaggerated. I think I need to make a public announcement that I would want to have you in studio in the near future, and you can expound and share with us the great vision that you have as SACC. Over to you,
No, before you say goodbye, Bishop, you know the story, Bishop, of the Chuluba, who didn't want to resign, who did not want to step down. And he had a meeting with the former President Thabo Mbeki, and Thabo Mbeki goes to public and says, Chuluba has promised me he will resign. He will not contest the elections. You are binding me in the public, Bishop, so that I have no option out, Bishop.
Thank you so much, Reverend Zwandile Molo. And so as we continue to chew on this, the truth is we are no different to the picture that is painted in the Bible of Israelites.
When we come back, I want to engage our indigenous psychologist here. Don't go away.
Can I just say something? I don't know. You might go for your advert. No. I want to say to Anele, and I want to speak because let me call it the overconfidence of Christianity. The overconfidence of Christianity has blinded some of us from the reality of models of healing and life that transcend what we perceive as truth.
Hold it right there. Hold it right there. Hold it right there. I think you encapsulate it well. The overconfidence of Christianity must never overshadow the impact of other methods of healing that we have from our history as we're moving into the future. Don't go away. We'll be back right after the break. And if Ntate Molo is still available, I will give him another minute or so. Let's see Marvin killing again. Please stay with us. We'll be back after the break.
Absolutely amazing. In actual fact, it confirms what many of us have been saying, that there is no reason for the church to not reimagine, not only in light of COVID, but the church should be continuously reimagining how it exists. Because one of the mysteries, or rather one of the phenomenal things about the church is how it is a concept that can be recreated in different contexts. You know, the church is not tied to one particular context, and that's how it should be done forever, but it can reimagine and recreate its expression in different contexts. And that is where we are failing. In actual fact, one of the things that stand out, I know Mzwandile Molo says this through this particular series, in the interviews we've had with him in the series, and he says the church is overconfident. The church is overconfident. It is adamant that how it does things and how it has always done things should not be questioned, and that's how it should always be. And quite frankly, I have a problem with that because I am part of the church.
I think there's definitely value in holding to certain tradition. Absolutely. Because tradition helps us, remain steadfast in what we believe and how we do things, so that traditionally, or throughout the ages rather, people's rights are not violated or things like that. I think there's a place for tradition, but tradition cannot limit our relevance given our current circumstances. There's so many cases where, but this is how we do it, and we miss those opportunities. So it's challenging in both ways, because yes, we are overconfident as a church at times, because we think that the way we do it, they must come to us, and it's relevant for everyone. But instead, we're now forced to bring church to people, which is more the Jesus model, if we want to call it that, where church is between all of us here in that moment. We bring it to each other, and we don't just sit back and say, this is the only way to do church. They must come to us if Jesus is relevant to them.
Here's the thing for me, Els. We must hold our traditions with humility and not arrogance. We must hold our traditions with humility as something that is life-giving, as something that holds the church together, as something that helps us transport old age wisdom, from those who were in close proximity to the days of Jesus to now. It's something that helps us hold all of that. But we must hold it in humility, acknowledging that our traditions could never, ever fully capture the full expression of God. They only express something of God, but they do not exhaust what God has to reveal to us. And for me, that's what it means to hold them in humility. And therefore, we should always compare our traditions against the ultimate agenda, which is life. Again, Reverend Mzwandile Molo says it so well, that our obligation is to life and not necessarily to regulations. And therefore, what we are meant to do is, fine, we've got church because church is life-giving. We invite people to Christ because Christ is life-giving. Christ gives us life in abundance. Then we hold up our traditions against this conviction. And where our traditions are betraying this conviction, we should question them, not as something that is flawed, but as something that needs to be expressed in a new way that can help us live up to this tradition, to this conviction.
I think you've said it all. I think that's the only way we can really find ourselves in a place where we are still relevant, yet we do not lose what we've held as sacred and also as our tradition. There is a deep value in being rooted in history and tradition. Absolutely. As we find ourselves now asking, as people have over the years, what is church? What does it look like? What does it mean to be a Christian in my lifetime? We're not the first people to go through a pandemic. It's not the first time for the church to face situations like this. We have world wars where the church was forced to re-examine. We have civil wars where the church is forced to re-examine. We have other pandemics where we're forced to re-examine. We cannot lose who we were and what tradition passes on for us, but we cannot hold on so tightly to what we were that we miss an opportunity to become what we need to be for people in that time, as the church is partnering with God hand in hand to be God's presence in the world for us. I think that's for me the way I see this and how we hold this conversation.
And I think in also doing that, we also need to acknowledge that there are dynamics we are faced with that church fathers, early church fathers, would have not been faced with. We need to acknowledge that they never got a chance to ask questions around communion and technology. We need to also acknowledge that they never got a chance to ask what it means to do church in a world of AI advancing at such a fast rate. One of the realities we need to accept is simple exegesis sermons will one day be done by robots.
Yeah.
and they'll probably do a better job.
It's already possible.
You
You,
know, and
Bible
therefore,
project it, and then
what
it's there.
we need to ask ourselves is, what is the role of the human being in this world that is advancing at such a fast pace? You know, we also need to ask ourselves, what are the ethical implications? What are the political implications? What are the technical implications of technology within the church space? You know, and that requires a deep sense of humility and not the arrogance that we sometimes display and show as the church.
Definitely. It gives us a lot to think about as the church and how we hold this. There's a lot of sensitivity to where people are at. We also have to look at the idea of the lack of access for some people. There is the idea of access for some, but then there's a lack of access for others. There is an abundance of human connection for some, and that's it's not a problem if they don't have it, but there's such a lack for other people. You know, what comes to mind when you speak about artificial intelligence is some apps nowadays, if you're sick, you enter some symptoms that you have, and it will give you a diagnosis. But people are not satisfied often with this because they miss the human interaction. They need that source of care and comfort for a doctor to say, oh, I can see you're not feeling well. I can see, and have that care. And so as a church, yes, we can have the artificial intelligence and we need to make use of it as a point of access and a touch point for people. But we cannot lose our pastoral response in how we interact as human to human. We're not just a content creating machine. Because if we get into that, we're competing with the for lack of a better word, the secular realm with such great content, whether it's Christian or not. There's amazing content. And so we cannot just get stuck on that. We really have to remember that as a church, we are the hand of care and the hand of touch, even if it is by proximity and by distance. At times, we have to find ways to reimagine, but not lose what we're all about.
And for me, that's exactly what it means to reimagine with humility. Acknowledging that there are places where we'll be easily replaced. Acknowledging that we live in an age of information and someone does not need to come to a church in order to find out that Luke was writing to Theophilus. And perhaps the place of all of those things is being replaced by technology. But we need to say, what does it mean to be a church in this context? Does it mean that I'm reaching out from a place of care? I'm reaching out from a place of social justice. I'm reaching out. But also, does it mean that we collaborate with all these technological devices that make life exciting to a certain degree? But we continue to reimagine. And so, do please join us for our next series. We're closing up today's series. I think it's been a fairly exciting series.
Great.
We've had some really amazing guests join us, and we just want to thank you also for joining us through this series. And we want to encourage you that as we continue to understand what it means to live in a life where, or rather to live in an age where there are vaccines, to live in an age where we have to take medication, vitamins in order to survive this pandemic. We will live in an age where we need to wear masks in order to survive this pandemic. I want to encourage you to continue to wrestle with these thoughts and not go for easy answers, not go for an easy way out, but continue to wrestle and say, what does it, or rather ask yourself the question, what does this mean for me as a Christian? In our next series, we're going to be covering the Rainbow Nation and what it means to live in South Africa in 2021 as we continue to grapple with issues of race, farm murders, and many other exciting topics.
Many, many things. Thank you so much for joining us for the series, for this episode. We look forward to starting the new series with you next week and in the coming weeks as we unroll this. And we really wish that you will have a great week and that you take care.